December 1987, Pope County, Arkansas. 16 people, fathers, mothers, children, co-workers, would never live to see the end of that Christmas season. And the man responsible wasn't a stranger, wasn't a drifter, wasn't a shadow lurking in the woods. He was a retired Air Force sergeant named Ronald Gene Simmons, a man whose victims included his wife, his sons, his daughters, his grandchildren, and finally, 2 innocent people who simply showed up for work on the wrong morning. A man who spent 7 days carrying out the deadliest family annihilation in American history. His motive? It wouldn't be greed, it wouldn't be rage, it would be something quieter, something that brewed behind the walls of a home isolated from the world, a motive built over decades, shaped by humiliation, control, and a worldview that collapsed under its own weight. This wasn't random. This was calculated. And once it began, nothing, absolutely nothing could stop it. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. But I warn you, this contains extreme violence based on real events. Pope County sits in the Arkansas River Valley between the Ouachita foothills to the south and the Ozarks rising to the north. In 1987, the population hovered under 40,000. Russellville was the county's anchor, a modest town with factory jobs, small churches, and the kind of winter where the air carries the scent of wood smoke and diesel from old pickup trucks. December that year was cold, not freezing, but bone damp, with temperatures between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Fog drifted low across the gravel roads at daybreak. At night, you could hear the hum of Highway 64, the distant whine of paper mill machinery, and little else. About 20 minutes outside town stood 14 acres of neglected land on a dirt path locals called Door Road. On it sat an old brown mobile home surrounded by makeshift additions. Plywood walls, plastic sheeting stapled over windows, tarps stretched tight over sagging roofs. The Simmons family called it Mockingbird Hill. Everyone else avoided it. America in the late 1980s was talking about Reagan's final year in office, the Iran-Contra scandal, Wall Street booms, and yet here, life moved slow. People fixed their own cars, hunted deer, and minded their own business. In a place like Pope County, individualism wasn't philosophy, it was survival. Into this world walked Ronald Gene Simmons, 47 years old. He stood about 5'9", stocky, with a weathered face, a thick beard, and heavy-lidded eyes that rarely revealed emotion. A man built from military routine, up early, chores done with precision, food rationed, money tracked obsessively. After serving 22 years in the U.S. Air Force and later as a civilian clerk at various bases, Simmons retired in 1979. What followed wasn't a gentle transition into small-town life. It was withdrawal, isolation. A man who had spent his entire adult life in command structures suddenly living with no one to command except his own family. Neighbors rarely saw him smile. Some never heard him speak. Inside the Simmons household were his wife, 7 children, and later multiple grandchildren, but outsiders didn't know the hierarchy within those walls. Ronald ruled the home like a private barracks. Opinions were punishable, disobedience was intolerable, and affection came only in ways he controlled. Every morning, Simmons woke before sunrise. He fed the animals, repaired fences, and checked the property line as though preparing for an invasion that never arrived. He rarely drove into town except for supplies. Letters piled up unopened. He didn't trust banks, utilities, or neighbors, so he built his property into a fortress of scrap wood and silence. What made him human? Before the killings, it was this. He loved Christmas. He loved the lights, the sense of order, the predictable rituals. For a man who hated unpredictability, Christmas was the only time he allowed himself to soften. But in 1987, something dark was already curdling beneath that holiday cheer. because Ronald believed the world had turned against him, and he believed his own family had betrayed him in the deepest way a man like him could imagine. The seeds of the massacre were planted years earlier. In 1981, Simmons was accused of fathering a child with his own teenage daughter, Sheila. A grand jury was convened. Investigators pressed for answers. Simmons refused to cooperate. Facing charges in New Mexico, he packed up his family in the middle of the night, abandoned their home, and fled the state. To him, the accusation wasn't just a crime, it was humiliation, a stain he believed the world had no right to place on him. He told his family this: "They're all liars. Everyone outside this house wants to destroy us." The family moved to Arkansas, where Simmons built an isolated new life under the philosophy that secrecy meant survival. But over the next years, something shifted. His children grew up. They married. They built their own lives. Lives he couldn't control. And by 1987, the greatest blow came. His daughter Sheila, now married and living independently, gave birth to a second child. A child not fathered by him. A child who symbolized her escape, a life beyond his orbit. Witnesses later described a moment during a rare family visit in the fall of 1987 when Simmons stared at Sheila's baby for too long, his face unreadable. When she asked if he wanted to hold the child, he reportedly responded, "No, that one isn't mine." That sentence was the catalyst, the point of no return. Attempts to resolve his growing resentment failed quietly. Family members distanced themselves. His wife Rebecca gently urged him to let the past go. His older sons suggested he get more work, find distractions, rejoin the world. But to Simmons, these weren't suggestions. They were betrayals. The breaking point came in early December when he received notice from his employer, the Woodline Motor Freight Office, that he was being let go after repeated behavioral issues, suspended first, then terminated. On December 18, 1987, after reading the final letter of dismissal, Ronald Gene Simmons made a decision. No more humiliation, no more abandonment, no more world outside. Planning began immediately. He stopped buying groceries. He withdrew the last of his savings in cash. He purchased ammunition quietly from multiple stores over several days. And he cleaned every firearm he owned with ritualistic care. A .22 caliber handgun, a .22 rifle, a .30-30 deer rifle. And he rolled up a length of rope. For 7 days, he rehearsed the order. Who would die first? Who would die last? Who would watch the others? And who would never see it coming? Christmas was approaching. And Simmons, once a man who loved Christmas lights, now prepared to extinguish his entire world, one family member at a time. December 22, 1987. Just after sunrise, the frost still clinging to the metal siding of the mobile home, Ronald Gene Simmons stepped outside and shut the screen door behind him with a soft click. He had already rehearsed this moment. He had known exactly who would die first. The people he believed were the roots of all disobedience: his wife Rebecca and his eldest son, 29-year-old Ronald Jr. Rebecca was inside, preparing breakfast. Simmons approached her without a word. Using a metal pipe he had hidden under a jacket, he struck her once, hard, fast, decisive. Before she fell, he shot her with his .22 pistol, ensuring silence. Her body dropped beside the small kitchen table they'd eaten at for nearly a decade. He moved next to his eldest son. Ronald Jr. had just woken up, still groggy, his face half covered with stubble and exhaustion. There was no argument, no attempt at defense. Simmons shot him point blank. The younger children were next. 17-year-old Loretta, 14-year-old Eddie, and 11-year-old Marianne were each killed one at a time, led into another room under the pretense of giving gifts early, then strangled, drowned, or shot. Simmons wrapped their bodies in coats and plastic sheeting, lining them carefully beside one another in the backyard tool trench he had dug days earlier for drainage. But the killings weren't over. They were barely beginning. Around midday, the door opened again. His son Billy, 23, arrived with his wife Renata and their infant daughter, 7-month-old Trey. Billy carried a bag of Christmas presents, smiling, expecting a family visit. Simmons greeted him calmly, even warmly. He took the gifts, set them aside, and shot Billy and Renata in the living room. Baby Trey never cried. Simmons smothered her with his bare hand. 2 hours later, another car crunched over the gravel. His daughter Sheila, the child at the center of decades of obsession, arrived with her husband Dennis and 2 children, 7-year-old Sylvia and 20-month-old Michael. Simmons showed no emotion, no hesitation. He shot Dennis first. In the hallway, he confronted Sheila. Some believe she understood in that final second what was happening. Others think she never had time. He shot her once in the head. Then he turned to the children. Sylvia, the granddaughter born from the incest allegation, was strangled. Baby Michael was killed the same way. By late afternoon, 14 members of the Simmons family were dead. Children, adults, infants. And the house was silent. Inside, Simmons arranged the bodies with a methodical ritualism. The adults were placed in a neat row in the backyard trench, each wrapped carefully in plastic, a military-style burial, without ceremony, without prayer, without dignity. The children and infants were laid side by side in the living room, covered with coats and blankets. Simmons decorated them with a few Christmas items, tinsel, a small ornament, like they were sleeping during a holiday nap. To him, this wasn't murder. This was cleansing. This was restoring order. He sat down in his recliner, turned on the television, drank beer, and waited for the next phase he had already prepared, the second wave.
December 23rd, December 24th. 2 days of silence. Inside the home, Simmons watched TV, drank, and wrote letters that investigators later described as rambling, paranoid, and grandiose. He rehearsed what he would do next. He made lists. He reviewed people he believed had wronged him, coworkers, supervisors, clerks at local businesses. On Christmas Eve, he drove into town, standing in line behind families buying toys, decorations, wrapping paper. No one noticed the man whose home was filled with corpses. He bought a drink, returned home, and spent Christmas Day alone in the house with the dead. Then came December 28, 1987. At 8:30 a.m., Simmons walked into the law firm of Peel, Eddy, and Gibbons, where he once had minor business. Inside were Secretary Kathy Kendrick, 24, and several employees. Kathy was Simmons' first non-family target. Months earlier, she had rejected his persistent advances and reported him. He viewed her as a humiliation. He walked directly to her desk, raised a .22 pistol, and shot her in the forehead. She died instantly. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply walked out. His next stop was the Taylor Oil Company, his former workplace. Inside the office were Joyce Butts, the woman who had informed him of his suspension, and office manager J.D. Chaffin. He walked in as if coming to resolve paperwork. He shot Joyce first. She survived but was critically wounded. He shot Chaffin next, killing him where he sat. Another employee, Vicki Jackson, fled through a back door, escaping seconds before Simmons reached her. Then he drove to the Woodline Motor Freight office, the job that had terminated him. He fired at employee Robbie Robison, wounding him severely. Robison survived only because his gun jammed. Simmons pointed the gun at his former supervisor, then suddenly lowered it, as if reconsidering, and walked outside. His final stop was the Mini-Mart convenience store where he occasionally bought supplies. There he held employees at gunpoint, but didn't fire. Witnesses noted that he seemed confused, distorted, or drained, as though the killings had emptied whatever rage had fueled him. A customer drove up, saw the gun, and called police. By the time officers arrived, Simmons was sitting calmly beside a soda machine, placing his pistol on the counter before they asked. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't run. When asked why he did it, Simmons reportedly answered, "Because I wanted to." By the end of the day, 16 victims were dead. 4 more were severely wounded. A prosecutor later said, "It was the coldest, most emotionless killing spree I've ever seen." And yet, the most chilling part was still ahead: the public reaction to his confession. News didn't travel slowly in 1987, not in a small southern town. Within hours, Pope County transformed into a scene of horror. Police cars blocking dirt roads, reporters gathering outside a home wrapped in yellow tape, neighbors crying as they recognized the names of the dead. At Mockingbird Hill, investigators entered expecting carnage. They weren't expecting order. The silence was described as unnatural. Christmas decorations were still hanging. Cigarette smoke lingered. Half a beer sat on the armrest of Simmons' reclining chair. Then they found the bodies. One officer stepped outside and vomited. Another whispered a prayer. A third was so overwhelmed he asked to be reassigned. 14 bodies. Children wrapped as though being tucked in. Adults buried in the ground like discarded objects. The sheriff later said it was like walking into a nightmare that refused to end. The community, churchgoers, factory workers, teachers, truck drivers, struggled to process what had happened. People who had lived in Russellville their entire lives said they'd never seen evil like that. Investigators recovered letters Simmons had written before the massacre. They found no remorse, no apology, no grief. Instead, they found a man who believed the world had rejected him and that he had every right to erase the world in return. Dozens of funerals were arranged. Graves were dug across multiple cemeteries. Christmas wreaths were still on display when the coffins were lowered. In a heart-wrenching scene, local citizens donated toys for the murdered children, placing them beside small headstones because they could not place them on a living lap. And yet, even with the weight of the tragedy crushing Russellville, the nightmare continued in the courtroom. Because Simmons didn't deny anything. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't plead insanity. He asked to be executed as soon as possible and insisted he wanted no appeals. And that triggered something America rarely sees: a man actively trying to speed up his own death sentence. The trial of Ronald Gene Simmons was unlike anything Arkansas had ever seen.
On January 11th, 1988, less than 2 weeks after the murders, chains rattled as Simmons was escorted into the Pope County Courthouse. He walked slowly, head down, beard untrimmed, wearing the same expression he carried during the killings: blank, detached, indifferent. Reporters noted that he never scanned the room. He never looked for familiar faces. He never looked at the families of victims. He simply stared forward, as though already resigned to whatever came next. But what shocked the courtroom wasn't his demeanor, it was his words. When the judge asked how he wished to plead, Simmons leaned toward the microphone and said quietly, without hesitation, "I plead guilty." I want the death penalty." Gasps echoed through the room. His lawyers froze. The prosecution blinked in disbelief. The judge, bound by procedure, refused the plea. A full competency evaluation was required. Doctors examined him for weeks. They searched for signs of psychosis, delusions, dementia, anything that would explain the scale and brutality of the massacre. But their conclusion shocked even seasoned investigators. He was mentally competent. He knew exactly what he was doing. He simply did not care. When Simmons finally returned to court in February 1988, the prosecution presented photographs, forensic evidence, autopsy reports, and testimony from survivors of the second wave of shootings. But Simmons refused to participate. He turned his head away as photos of his murdered children were shown. He closed his eyes when asked to describe the killings. At times, he seemed to sleep. Prosecutor John Bynum, who would later become a judge, told the jury, "This man is not insane. He is not confused. He is evil." The jury took less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Death sentence recommended. When asked if he wished to make a final statement before sentencing, Simmons spoke only one sentence: "I want it carried out." It was the first death penalty in Arkansas to be requested by the defendant rather than fought. But Simmons wasn't finished. He wanted more. Because this first trial covered only the non-family murders, a second trial covering the 14 family members was still ahead. And in that second courtroom, Simmons would make one final chilling request that stunned legal experts across the country. May 1988, the second trial. This time, Simmons was charged with the murders of his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. When the judge asked how he wished to plead, Simmons didn't hesitate. Guilty. And then he added, "I waive all rights to appeal. I wish to be executed quickly." His own attorneys tried to intervene, telling the judge they objected to their own client's wishes, but Simmons insisted. He wrote letters to the governor. He ordered his lawyers to not file anything on his behalf. This created a legal crisis. Could a defendant force the state to kill him faster? The Arkansas Supreme Court eventually ruled that yes, if he was competent, he had the right to waive all appeals. Simmons was officially placed on death row, but unlike most inmates, he refused visitors. He refused religious counsel. He refused recreation time. He refused media interviews. He spent almost his entire incarceration alone, in silence, often sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the wall for hours. One guard later said, "He didn't live on death row. He waited on it." On June 25, 1990, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton signed Simmons' execution warrant. In doing so, Clinton made Simmons the first person in U.S. history to be executed after waiving all post-conviction appeals under newly strengthened capital punishment laws. The date was set, June 25, 1990. At the Cummins Unit in Grady, Arkansas, Simmons was led into the execution chamber wearing state-issued white clothing. No family members came. None were alive to come. No friends, no spiritual advisors, no witnesses who knew him personally. Only corrections officers, journalists, and officials. He declined a final meal. He declined final words. When asked one last time if he wished to say anything, he replied, "No." At 9:02 p.m., the execution began. At 9:08 p.m., Simmons was pronounced dead by lethal injection. 6 minutes. A man who had destroyed an entire bloodline with his own hands was gone. There were no tears, no memorials, no ceremonies. Not a single person stepped forward to claim his body. He was buried in a simple grave in Arkansas, marked only by a number, not a name. The prosecutor who tried him said, "For some killers, execution is a punishment. For Simmons, it was a reward. He wanted it." The question remained, was he seeking punishment? Or was he trying to silence the world before it could judge him? The answer, perhaps, came from his own final written note, found in his cell. Let judgment come quickly.
The 1987 Russellville Christmas Massacre remains the worst family annihilation in American history. Not just because of the number of victims, but because of the mindset behind it. Most family annihilators commit their crimes in a single explosive moment: rage, fear, financial pressure, despair. But Simmons wasn't like them. He was patient. He was methodical. He planned for days, enacted for 7, and showed no remorse afterward. Criminal psychologists classify him as a narcissistic patriarchal annihilator, a man whose worldview is built entirely around control. When that control collapses, they don't just lash out, they erase everything that reminds them of their perceived failure. What makes the Simmons case so terrifying is not the brutality, though it was extreme. It's the clarity, the coldness, the precision, the absence of emotion. He wasn't driven by mental illness. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't in a psychotic break. He believed calmly and sincerely that his family had betrayed him, and in his worldview, betrayal was a death sentence. Understanding this kind of killer forces us to confront a darker psychological truth. Some people cannot accept a world where they are not in control. And when reality breaks the identity they've built, they break everything around them. For the people of Pope County, the scars never faded. Every Christmas, memorial candles still flicker in windows. The older generation still whispers about the year the world stopped, and the land where Mockingbird Hill once stood was eventually cleared, leaving nothing but grass, wind, and a silence that hides the unspoken memory of what happened there. 16 lives ended. Dozens more were forever changed. A town lost its innocence, and one man who believed the world owed him obedience left behind a legacy of horror that still echoes nearly 4 decades later. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more deep dive investigations into forgotten American crimes. Your support helps us bring these difficult stories to light with the respect the victims deserve. Thank you for watching.